everyone, let's get started. Happy Monday, welcome back. Hope you had a nice weekend. New theory, new soundtrack, as you heard. And I also got some really good reviews from your TAs last week. Apparently, you guys are kind of the oddball students because all three of my TAs had positive things to say about all their recitation sections. So, very, very good. We just finished up our first major section. We're entering the second one now. If you do as good this time around as you did in the one on realism, I think that you all will be in excellent shape for the midterm in a few weeks. So with that said, let's then move on to our next unit, the School of Liberalism. And I have up here a painting of a rather nice-looking individual. I'm sure that you all know who this man is. Who is he? Who is he?
Woodrow Wilson.
Woodrow Wilson, right? And what do you know about Woodrow Wilson? Among a few things.
He was the president of the United States.
He was a U.S. president, yes.
And
yes.
he also taught, I think he taught at Princeton. And he did
yes, he did. As a matter of fact, what did he do first? Was he at Princeton first or Washington first? What did he do first?
Princeton.
He was a teacher at Princeton University. You may have heard of this little community college down the road from us. And I mention this because, the School of Liberalism, if you've done the reading, is significantly different in tone, in outlook, and in disposition about how humanity happens to be, as well as how the international arena happens to be. And I think that there is something to be said about, at the risk of tuning my own profession, academics are weird people because they often have a lot of insightful ideas about how the world works, but 9 times out of 10, those ideas very rarely enter into practical reality. Princeton University, how many of you have been to Princeton before? You kind of walked around campus, and it's kind of, it's kind of addictive. You kind of walk around, and it kind of looks like a little enclosed bubble, right? It's kind of look like you're walking around Hogwarts or something like that, right? And there is something to be said about the so-called orange bubble. I taught at Princeton 10 years ago for a semester, and it was a rather interesting experience. Students were somewhat bright, but they have a very inward look around themselves, right? As soon as you go to Princeton, it's kind of like there's the Princeton campus, and then there's the rest of the world outside. They're rather almost scared. They knew that I came from Rutgers. The big question everybody asked me was like, what's it like in New Brunswick? Is it safe or whatever? It's like, it's fine. It's not as gentrified as it is now, but they were almost like, wow, where's your battle scars or whatever it is? I mention this because Wilson spent a good deal of his time. And here we are talking about late 19th, early 20th century. An academic, no less. Okay? And Wilson is certainly not the founder of the idea of liberalism, but he's one of those individuals that we give credit to put into practice. Probably one of the very first people to put the philosophy of liberalism into some kind of diplomatic service, into some kind of state rhetoric. Okay? And it is rather ridiculous of somebody coming from academia to have a very optimistic, almost naive view of the world. And if there's anything that critics of liberalism will give them is that they are a naive bunch of people. They're optimistic, but that optimism usually is not that far from naivete. And that's not to say that the discipline is useless. Far from it. Okay? What we will find today and on Wednesday is that liberalism answers a lot of things that realism simply cannot do. Okay? We ended class last time by noting the rather interesting predictions of John Mearsheimer. Interesting, not accurate. Liberalism, on the other hand, makes up a lot for the weaknesses of realism by asking really 4 important questions, 4 rhetorically important questions. Is there a solution to the problems of international anarchy? And this is something that the realists are just like, no, of course not. Anarchy is forever, right? There's just never going to be any change to it. Liberals are saying, hang on a second here. All right? I'm not comfortable living in this state of perpetual anarchy. Right? Can we maybe not eliminate anarchy, but can we make it less anarchic? Can we make it slightly more controllable? What can be done? to remedy imperfect information. Now, at the risk of beating up on realism, because a lot of the disciplines of realism predate modern times, liberalism really comes into its own around the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So liberalism does have one major advantage, and that is the advantage of modernity, modern technology, modern communication. And with that in mind, I think it's not that difficult to surmise that with the advent of greater communication, and here I'm not even talking about the internet, I'm just simply talking about things like the telegraph, the telephone, whatever it happens to be, communication, not only between states, but just communication between individuals, has exponentially increased to the point where even today, I mean, it's somewhat weird for somebody to not have internet, unless you're like a monastic or something like that. So what can be done to remedy imperfect information? In other words, how can liberalism not only answer the question of perpetual anarchy, but how can anarchy be reduced by increasing the degrees of information and, more to the point, increasing the probability of trust and cooperation between states? And that's what we're really looking for, right? Increasing trust and cooperation. Number 3, do states only pursue power and security? Well, that's, a dyed-in-the-wool realist will say, that's it, It doesn't matter. You can just reduce it to those two things, power and security, power and security. A liberalist will say, well, look, human morality and human compassion oftentimes do get in the way of things. Do states take action out of sympathy, out of philanthropy, out of a sense of helping out a fellow neighbor, a fellow state, even if it doesn't automatically benefit them? Okay? It's not an absolute gain, but could we possibly see relative gains? Relative gains in which both sides benefit through cooperation. That's not necessarily just self-interest in power and self-help security. Finally, number 4, how can we get out of the security dilemma? Now, this one is probably the most important in Wilson's time, because as you correctly pointed out, he was U.S. president, but when exactly? What event, what major event took place during Wilson's presidency?
World War I.
First World War. And the First World War is a classic example of a security dilemma that has spiraled out of control to the point where a small trigger, right, it really wasn't that much of a small, bang bang in Sarajevo on June 28th, but, Archduke getting shot, and within a month, Germany is declaring war on France and violating Belgian neutrality. Okay? How did that happen? The series of alliances that dominated the European scene for the previous 30 to 50 years could certainly be an answer, or at least provide some explanations. What a liberalist is asking is, how do we get out of that, perpetual spiral of violence, right? Isn't it reasonable to suggest that if you find yourself in a security dilemma with another country, is it that difficult to kind of get the other country on the phone and say, hey, we don't have any plans to attack you? Oh, you don't? No, I don't. Oh, well, thanks for telling me, type of thing, right? It's not that difficult, right? So if the answer is, can we get out of the security, no, I'm sorry, the question is, can we get out of the security dilemma, and the answer is yes, then of course the next question is how? How can we get out of the security dilemma? One of the major hypotheses to that is simply greater communication. Greater communication, and here is where liberalism really drives the point home. A greater sense of mutual interdependence and mutual commitment. Locking states into constant communication, locking states into some form of economic gain or ideological gain will make the possibility of war increasingly unlikely. So the other thing, so sort of like a follow-up question to how do we get out of the security dilemma is ultimately, can war be avoided? Can war be avoided? Some of the more some of the more optimistic people even go so far as asking, can war be abolished? Can war be abolished? Some of the more diehard supporters are definitely in the yes category. Okay, so with all of that said, liberalism is a far more progressive outlook on the world. There's no question about it, especially if you compare that to realism. Whereas realists will say humans are greedy, they're manipulative, they're selfish, they're self-interested, that's just the way that it is. Liberals are kind of like, oh man, that's just not it. Humans are by nature good. Humans are by nature good. They are only led astray by fear and uncertainty. Right? That's the first thing you need to understand. By nature, humans are good. They may do bad things. They may do things that promote violence, but almost all of that is related to fear and uncertainty. And I might even add, the fear of uncertainty. That's not even challenging some of the tenets of realism. That's looking at one of the basic tenets of realism and saying, well, no wonder people do bad things. Realism is fear of uncertainty. Therefore, we take necessary precautions. Liberalism is like, okay, so you take necessary precautions, which means that you're going to be selfish and you're going to be self-serving. But if you all are on the same page, you're not going to be like that. So left to your own devices, you're more or less going to be, ordinary, decent people. I'm going with that. Let's go with that. Let's start with that. Okay? With that understanding, there's a potential. There's a potential for human progress and cooperation. Okay? If humans are by nature good, and they are cooperative, and they follow certain sets of laws and ethics that, you don't need any kind of, religion or ideology to tell you, you just kind of know the basic rules of the game here. There is potential for human progress and cooperation. To that, we go a little bit further. Liberalism is an IR practice that begins around late 19th, early 20th century, but its philosophies go back to the period of the Enlightenment. So here we're talking about the 18th century. Okay? Right around the time that the United States declared its independence. So here we're talking about like mid-1700s. So we're looking at the writings of Voltaire, of John Locke, and others. And out of that Enlightenment period comes one of the perennial arguments that one of the basic virtues of human quality is the value of liberty. I know that the words liberty and freedom are kind of thrown around like buzzwords these days, okay? But this means something back then. The virtue of individual liberty is a cornerstone in the philosophy of liberalism. And to that, individual liberty is backed up by faith in human reason, trust, and shared interests, all of which trump fear. Fear is a natural emotion, but fear only comes in amid ignorance. Fear comes in amid uncertainty. With certainty, with greater degrees of information, liberalism argues, harmony will overtake anarchy. That doesn't mean that we're going to get towards a world government, although some people go like, they want that, but those are weirdos. Doesn't mean we're going to get there. What it does mean is that common interests, common knowledge, and common ideology will create greater degrees of harmony. The international arena will still be anarchic because of a lack of a world government. But just as realism said, anarchy does not mean chaos. Liberalism says, you know what, I don't want to know what it doesn't mean. I want to know what it can mean. Liberalism looks at it and says anarchy could very well mean harmony. Liberalism, or anarchy, could mean stability. I know it's a paradox, but putting faith in human reason, trust, and shared interests over fear will get us to there. And conflict and warfare, this is also a radical departure from the realist camp. Warfare is not inevitable. Just as the liberals put their faith in the concept of liberty, they denounce warfare as evil and barbaric. Realists will look at that and say, yeah, okay, I'm not arguing that, I'm just saying that it's inevitable. Liberals are saying, no, we can actually avoid that. Because war is not so much a result of politics failing. Liberals will argue war comes when fear and uncertainty overtake everything else. See the difference in thinking? War happens when fear and uncertainty trump human reason, trust, and shared interests. Wars will happen, and here's the best part, the liberalists in Wilson's day will kind of Monday morning quarterback on the outbreak of World War I. And they'll try to ask, could World War I have been avoided? Or at the absolute least, could the violence between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire been contained? The $64,000 question is, could we have kept Germany from marching into France? And the answer is yes, we could have. Yes, we could have. Had all the major powers revealed more of their cards, rather than hiding behind diplomatic smokescreens to mask their own agendas. So when states think selfishly, congratulations, you're gonna get a realist scenario. When states act cooperatively, it ain't that difficult, Sherlock. We may very well get, and here's the ultimate goal, perpetual peace. If we can achieve perpetual peace, man, we've done something good. So liberalism is a far more progressive understanding of the world than realism, which basically says that we're just in this constant cycle of viciousness. Okay? All right, with that said, like realism, let's take a look at some of the philosophical backgrounds. There are four essential institutions, four main pillars of liberalism. Number one, citizens possess equal civil rights. So right off the board, liberalism begins with an understanding that state government is some form of democracy. Realism doesn't care. Realism does not care what type of government your state is. Liberalism says in order for this to work, the first thing you got to do is to be a democracy. Why? Not because we like voting and not because we like all that kind of jazz, but because in a democracy, it is the most likely governmental setup where subjects, the people, are considered citizens. There's, again, we talked about this almost on the first day of class, a major difference between citizens and subjects, or the citizens and the masses. With the understanding of citizens, the people have some kind of invested responsibility to the state. They vote, they pay taxes, but most importantly, they can also vote the proverbial bums out of office if they are not living up to their potential. So a state of citizens possessing equal civil rights is an enlightened state. It is a developed state. It is an advanced state. There are high degrees of literacy, considerable degrees of education. Number two, sovereigns derive authority from the consent of the electorate. There's another shout out to democracy. So right now we haven't even entered the international arena. But a liberal understanding denotes a state in which its leaders do not derive power from some divine right. They do not derive power from tyranny. They do not derive power from disproportionate authority. In this sense, the leaders of a state are elected, and they are beholden to a set of laws that are codified in this one thing that we all have, we all love, sometimes we defend with more, gumph than we've read this whole thing. But what is it that all these laws are codified in here? A constitution. Okay? Laws that are constitutional laws are the sole and absolute authority of the land. Realism doesn't care about that. Realism says, what's the sole authority? Power. Just raw power, wherever it comes from. Liberalism says, no. We need to think a little bit more developed here. Constitutional authority. That's where power comes from. Number three, the recognition of property rights. So you may think, property? What the hell? Got to remember, this is the Enlightenment period. which means that one of the major philosophers of the Enlightenment is John Locke. And before, Thomas Jefferson kind of paraphrased his Holy Trinity into what's in the Declaration of Independence, John Locke came up with 3 fundamental rights that all humans are endowed with. What are they? The John Locke version.
Life, liberty, and property
Life,
rights.
liberty, and property, right? Which TJ turned into pursuit of happiness, or whatever it is, some kind of fortune cookie metaphysical thing, right? John Locke, good British guy, much more rational, right? Life, liberty, and property. Why is property so important? Why is property so important?
Because at the time, the crown owned all property, mostly.
Sort of, kind of, the British crown was denuded of a lot of power over the centuries, but I can see where you're going with this.
It's not talking like most absolute monarchies.
Okay. Yes, we talk about the recognition of property rights. Property rights means who owns the land? We do, right? You want a piece of land, either for your house, your business, whatever it happens to be. Private property, you're absolutely right, is the exact antithesis of absolutist government. And you cannot be absolutist with private property. Citizens are not going to allow it. They'll laugh you to the gallows. Okay? So the concept of property rights is also important because property rights also implies the presence of some type of market economy. So in addition to states being democratic, there's also this little indirect shout out to a type of economic system that's also somewhat important for a liberalist system to work. What type of economic structure is that?
Free market.
Free market. Better known as capitalism. Okay? Free market economy. Number 4, supply and demand economics. I basically gave the answer away right there. Okay? So a state that is defined by constitutionally embodied rights for its citizens and a developed economy based upon supply and demand. So here we're already denoting a developed system. We're noting a developed political parliamentary system where power is not only fragmented, but it is endowed ultimately with the electorates. Okay, so with that said, let's take that on the international front. Because what's important to understand is that with that setup, the leadership of a country cannot simply engage in foreign policy with reckless abandon. Realists will say the same thing. Yeah, don't go nuts. But a liberal system will actually put greater checks on the choices for would-be princes about when to use war, when to use the military, when to opt for war. Under the principles of liberalism, states do not compete for resources, they cooperate. Okay? In the olden days, your neighboring state had something that you wanted. Well, one way of getting it is sending in an army. I'm going to go, I'm going to take it, I'm going to annex it, yay, now I own it. Liberalism says you don't need to do that. First of all, not only is war bad, I'm not even playing the bleeding heart hippie here, but war is also financially costly. Why do you want to do that? There's a better way of getting it. You can just simply cooperate. Hey, you've got that. I'd like some of that. Oh, I've got this. You'd like some of this. I'll tell you what, I'll give you a bucket of this for a barrel of that. And how about we trade every Saturday? Cool? Yay. You know what that's called? Transnational economy. Competing for resources does a number of things. First of all, it increases the role of cooperation between states. Number 2, if there is a deep-seated interdependency of mutual benefit, of mutual resources, the likelihood of war is going to be significantly reduced because you don't go to war with your major trading partner. Why would you? 2, in order for that to happen, we put faith in this one thing that realists up to Ken Walls have had a difficult time trying to figure out. And that is the role of international institutions. Whereas realists kind of, sort of now acknowledge that they have some use, liberalism loves institutions. They just embrace it. Like, institutions are awesome. The United Nations, the League of Nations, the European Union, League of Women Voters, whatever it happens to be. Okay? These things are awesome. And why is that? Because international institutions, as we will discuss probably next week, are one of the most instrumental things in reducing uncertainty and promoting cooperation. They don't necessarily take the role of a world government, but they do function as a very good intermediary between states. Does that mean that they supersede the policies of states? That's open for debate. But most liberals are going to say the state has still the final authority. Number 3. If all of this so far is true, or at the absolute least much more plausible than realism, then it stands to reason that anarchy does not always lead to war. A realist will just simply say, hey, at one point there's no chaperone around here to stop the insane person from doing something. Liberalism will actually say, no, we have medicine for that insane person. We have just degrees of cooperation. We have codes of conduct. We have reputations that need to be upheld. Anarchy may still and forever define the international system, but it does not, and it should not, lead to war. Number 4, not all states are equal. Realism is a paradox, because on one level they say states are the ultimate authority. But at the same time, realism also acknowledges that there are some states that are more powerful than others. Liberals don't disagree with this. But where they do differ is what that inequality means. A realist will say, there's a powerful state, there's a weaker state. Therefore, the powerful state is basically the alpha in the pack and can do whatever it wants. The weaker state has to just simply hope that it's not eaten. The liberal will look at this and say, there's a powerful state, there's a weaker state. The powerful state, we hope, we think, we're just going to run with, is powerful not because of its army and not because of its proverbial prince. It is powerful because of its economy. It's powerful because of its diplomatic clout. It's powerful because of the network of cooperation it has created. And there is no country that better exemplifies this degree of liberalist power than Great Britain. Specifically Great Britain from the 18th through the early 20th centuries. Because you all remember back then, Great Britain had an empire. And it was widely regarded as one of the most powerful empires in Western history since Rome. Now, Great Britain's imperial strength was largely defined by its economic reach as well as its interdependent cooperative network of trade. Right? Most of British imperial territory was guaranteed by sea routes. It wasn't a big sprawling landmass. That type of empire was largely built on free market capitalism, or at the absolute least, the rudimentary foundations of free market capitalism. So that meant to be part of the British imperial system, meant to actually increase one's standard of living. And why not? Right? There's a major difference between, let's say, British colonialism and French colonialism. French colonialism tries to assimilate everybody. British colonialism basically is like, hey, look, we understand that we control India. There's no way we're going to get them to be rational thinking Episcopalians. Okay? So you know what? You do whatever it is that you're going to do. We're just going to trade with you. That's cool. We good? We good? Yeah. Okay? With that understanding, not all states being equal, the powerful states then have an obligation to keep stability and peace in the world. Which country do you think embodies that type of spirit inherited from the old British imperial system today?
The United States.
Us. That's right, the United States. And especially between 1945 and let's say 1995, the United States was one of the major, well, not the major, it was the major, it was the founder of what we consider today to be the neoliberal transatlantic economic free trade system. What makes the United States so powerful is that it took the economic ideas of Great Britain and ran it, and ran hard, to the point where today, the biggest competitor to American strength and hegemony is arguably coming from what country? China. And how is China seen as a threat? Militarily? Diplomatically? Economically? Economically. Here's a country that is still officially, technically, communist. And yet it's the second largest capitalist economy in the world. Doesn't make sense. Why is that? Because even China realized, you want to get ahead in the world, you basically bandwagon. You basically go with the economic cooperative system. Okay? So not all states are equal. We're fine with that. Those states that are more powerful shouldn't dominate, but they should lead. They should guide. They should direct. And they should influence, not dominate. And finally, on the international front, and this is where things tend to get both interesting and also dangerous, the promotion and protection of human rights. Whereas realism says keep ideology out of foreign entanglements, liberalism says embrace it. Totally embrace it, wear it like a badge and march in its pride rally. Embrace ideology, because ideology is what is going to reduce the level of uncertainty, and ideology will, if properly used, will provide us, eventually, with that understanding of perpetual peace. So therefore, war may be horrible. It may be barbaric. Except for one exception. One fundamental exception. If war is waged in the pursuit of self-determination and the pursuit of freedom, then, only then, go to war. In fact, if that's what the cause is, not only should you support someone going to war, you should get yourself involved as well. That's a major, major departure from realism. Realism basically says war is inevitable, but try to avoid it. Liberalism says war is horrible, but there are some wars that actually do some good if they conform to the protection of human rights.